Welcome everybody to PTGA's first pre-season summit. My name's Alex Cowan. I'll be tonight's moderator. I'm on the board of directors of the Polar Tourism Guides Association, and I'd like to welcome tonight's panelists. From IAATO's secretariat, we have Lisa Kelley. We have our penguin experts, Tom Hart and Meagan Dewar, and we also have ELs and naturalists Marieke, Egan and Matt Burnaby joining us tonight. PTGA intends to host a summit like this before each polar season, where we can discuss the most important topics, seasonal updates, difficult questions and grey areas. We've disabled the Q&A function so that all questions happen publicly in the chat and you can all reply to those questions to each other. So we'll hope you'll discuss tonight's topics alongside us in the chat. Tonight we'll be discussing the seasonal updates first of all, then some grey areas and difficult questions, followed finally by an open Q&A. It's been really great this season to see the IAATO webinar series as a resource. And if you haven't watched that yet, I urge you to log into your account on the IAATO website and watch them. The intention here is for us to reiterate most of the new and most important points there before moving on to our grey areas and difficult questions. This year, like every year, we must prepare ourselves to do things differently. There are different things that we'll have to do this season and things we'll have to do differently. And it's always easy to say, but we've always done it this way. But we all know that really that isn't a logical reason for doing something and doesn't even necessarily mean that we should have been doing it in the first place. So let's all embrace these changes, even if we feel like they make our lives harder, even if we feel like the changes make it a lesser experience for the guests. All these changes are for good reasons. So we're going to embrace them. As professional polar guides, we're specialists in taking dynamic situations in our stride, and changes in the operational procedures are no different. So we're going to start with the seasonal updates, and we're going to dive straight into a discussion around avian flu. So we know last year in Antarctica, there were changes to the operational procedures, which meant that whereas before we could allow penguins and other birds to approach us, now we have to back away from them. So I do really recommend you read The Risk of Avian Influenza in the Southern Ocean, a Practical Guide document, which is in the Biosecurity Guidelines section of the FOM. So if you haven't downloaded the FOM Sync app yet, please make sure it's downloaded to your computer and updated, and also get the IAATO Polar Guide app onto your phone. And it's also very much worth watching Tom and Meagan's full avian flu IAATO webinar and the seabird strike session. We're not going to repeat all that information in our summit, but there are a few things I'd like us to highlight. So first of all, I'm going to ask Tom to speak to us and just remind us, what is it we're looking out for to be sure that when we're landing, we're not landing somewhere where there is bird flu?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'll hand over to Meagan in a moment just to say a bit more about what this is. But in terms of symptoms, avian flu is lucky in the sense that it displays quite obviously. So it's neurological, and if you see animals shaking, twitching, moving in circles, and of course any mass mortality, then that's highly likely to be something like avian flu that we're scared of. That's particularly what we're on the lookout for this year. There's some other symptoms as well, like in gannets in the north, we've seen bright green feces, so guano that's pretty green. The point is that this probably just adds a tiny bit of time to what we would be doing anyway. This is something you can do as part of your pre-landing assessment. Most of us are landing on islands. Some places we might be coming into a wildlife congregation, or aggregation rather, from above over land. But we can just spend a few minutes, particularly with more experienced naturalists, scanning the colony and looking for weird stuff. And you should know it if you see it. There are videos attached to that paper that we've got, and you can search Twitter and online. There's some really nice videos that show exactly what it is of animals in distress that you might want to look for. Maybe with that, hand over to Meagan.
That's great. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so Meagan, if you could tell us a little bit about what we should be doing differently this year in terms of managing this.
I think probably one of the big things is sort of making sure from a biosecurity point of view, we are cleaning more rigorously. So making sure people's boots and everything are properly cleaned once they get back. I know it's hard, but trying to avoid sitting down, especially in any areas where there's bare ground, lots of birds, lots of poo. The environment is a big spreader of the virus. It loves water, so it can survive in water. It survives in the ground. And by water, we mean even a puddle. If a bird has pooed in that puddle, if feces has washed into that puddle, other birds can get infected from that. And if you walk through that, you will get virus on your shoes and so forth. So that's why we're sort of quite big on not sitting down, because it can survive. Cold weather actually increases the longevity of the virus. So Antarctica, unfortunately, is going to be somewhere that could, enable it to be active a lot longer. So it's harder to clean clothing than it is shoes. We do need to make sure we're doing our ViraClean and that properly. So making sure that it is staying on there for the appropriate timing. And as we said earlier, avoiding interaction with animals. There is that risk to humans. So it is a zoonotic disease. It's a class 3 zoonosis. So it is quite a concerning one. And it's not just seabirds that we're concerned about. It does infect mammals as well. So we have already had seals dying from this in North America. So, all wildlife, we need to sort of keep our distance from them.
And we should point out, as a practical note, it's been slightly downgraded, the risk to humans. Certain strains have been really pathogenic to humans, particularly poultry workers, but there remains a risk. We don't know what it is. We know it's not as bad as the worst strain, but if you're scrubbing boots and you set up a scrubbing station on the ship or on shore, wear masks. Because if you're creating aerosols, if you have scientists on board and they're going into colonies, they should be wearing masks. And the same, the one potential big difference is you might, if this did hit, you might be evacuating a base or somewhere like Lockroy. So just really, make sure they are biosecured and safe as they come on.
That's great. Thank you both for that. So I'm seeing some big differences here, as well as the increased biosecurity. It's backing away from those penguins when they approach you. And that's going to be a big change for a lot of people, is understanding we can't say that thing we've always said in the past, like, the penguins don't read the guidelines. So, you can let them come close. Now that is different. When the penguins start approaching you, you need to back away. And I'd like to talk more about what Meagan said there about avoiding sitting down. I'd like to bring Lisa in here as well. So poor Lisa recently has been putting up with endless voice messages from me in the middle of the night, asking her questions about the details of this. But I think we've had some really great discussions. So I was hoping you could say a little bit more on the purpose behind the no sitting, bum sliding, snow angels around wildlife here, Lisa?
Yep, absolutely. And happy to be here and happy to answer the questions. As far as the bum sliding and sitting down, obviously our number one responsibility is to help to protect Antarctica. And by taking these steps, that is one way that we can do so, by hopefully minimizing any risk of spread of avian influenza, or COVID is also, of course, another concern that you'll see in those biosecurity instructions. So on snow, on ground, around wildlife, please don't sit down or lie down. We know we know it is a common practice. It's even in the IAATO instructions and the guidelines to, take a moment, sit, relax, watch, and just take it all in. This year, I'm afraid it will have to be standing, and this may go on for quite a while. As Meagan said, Antarctica is cold. It is allowing it to stay around longer. So we will have to see as the seasons go on. As far as bum sliding, basically in a lot of the places where you're bum sliding, you're walking up a hill where penguins have walked. If we're thinking about Brown Station, Nico Harbor, Cooverville, and then you yourself are then taking all the gunk on your boots and everything else and sliding, and no control at all over any of your materials. So we would ask that there's no bum sliding this year around penguin colonies. And also just to keep in mind about even if you find a place, you're at Portal Point and you're sitting, away, there's not wildlife there, but you're sitting on the snow, a bird may have pooped there. You can't control where the skuas and the sheathbills and everything go. So you do want to continue to really, really maintain that biosecurity process when you are heading back to the ship.
That's great. Thanks, Lisa. And then I'd like to add a few points there from our discussion, because I know lots of people have questions about this. So as you just outlined, there's no bum sliding at any penguin colonies on the basis that you track that poop up there on your boots and then it just goes all over you and you can't biosecure once it's all over you. But places like Nico, you walk to the top there, you're away from the wildlife. We considered it was okay to sit there, but then you've got to biosecure all your clothes when you get back. So sitting far from the colonies is okay on the basis it's controllable. You've only sat down in a few patches you can disinfect. So sitting at the top of Nico is okay. Sitting at the top of Cooverville, sitting at places like Portal Point, the top at Booth Island. But of course, anywhere near wildlife is not acceptable, and bum sliding is not acceptable anywhere. So I hope that really clears up the details of that. So we're looking for, where can we control contamination onto our clothing? Can we keep our clothing clean between the landing sites? Because we'll go and potentially sit down somewhere else. But in general, the easiest thing is not sitting. But we know from an operational point of view, that's tricky to manage, people not sitting down, especially with, say, elderly people. So I wanted to call on Marieke and Matt here for your opinions on, how we manage this operationally.
Yeah, I think for me, and I think for the guests as well, if we change things or we operate differently than previous seasons, and some guests may have had friends traveling before, they've heard ideas of what is possible and what not, and suddenly we're operating differently. I think the first key to managing it operationally is give the guests and of course staff and the team as well, proper information why these changes are now in place. So I think a lot of the guests will probably not have heard or not aware of the risk of avian flu down south. So for me, it will be important to explain it during briefings, the IAATO briefing being done on board, adding slides to that briefing or another briefing in the evening, to really explain the reasoning and what we're now dealing with and the risks of avian flu and what we need to adapt in our approaches. So I think just really explaining the why and the reasoning and the responsibility, of course, that we all have, the people traveling there and us working there, to minimize the risk of spreading and really protect the wildlife and ourselves. So that will be, I think, one step is the explanation and the why. I think emphasizing the responsibility that we have of responsible travel in such a remote place where things can go pear-shaped pretty quickly if we don't really are so careful in the way we approach the landings. And then reminders, I think when we as expedition leaders receive guests on shore and we welcome them to the shores and explain what they can and cannot do and where they can and cannot go, is adding that information, a reminder, again, please do not sit down. And having the staff, of course, manage that on shore as best we can. And yeah, I'm sure we are going to get the questions, but I have trouble standing or I can't stand for a long time, someone who's elderly. I think that will be tricky sometimes, but I think as long as we are very clear in the why, I'm hoping that all guests will understand the importance and able to cooperate. And then, of course, thanking them, I think, at night too for their cooperation and reminding. I think these things cannot be reminded enough.
I think Marieke just covered all the main points there really well. The only thing that I would really want to add to that is that in order to enact those understandings within the guests and also to turn it into a common practice on shore during landings, it takes a lot of vigilance on behalf of the naturalists and all the guides. So it's not just something that we say once. It's like sitting and sliding or anything else, like washing our boots. It's something that we repeat over and over and over again, right to the very end of the experience, at the end of the tour, so that it is commonplace, common practice. And, you know, sometimes we even see guests, you know, there's a limit to how much we want this happening, but sometimes we see guests reminding each other as well. And if we can start having guests be ambassadors for their specific tour and enforcing certain best practices like limiting sitting or limiting contact in areas near wildlife, then we can succeed. But that takes a lot of reminders and a lot of vigilance on behalf of all the staff at every single landing. So if we can do that together, then we can be successful.
That's great. Thanks, guys. Yeah, I think it's going to be quite tricky in some ways to manage because, you know, lots of people want to sit down and relax. And of course, there's the issue of somebody's elderly or they've hurt their leg or they're just very tired and, you know, they need to take a break. And this is one of those gray areas where, okay, well, we need to allow a bit of sitting here. And then that's when our skills as guides come in of managing that, not just with that person, but managing the perception with the people around as well. Lisa, what should we do if we suspect cases of avian flu at a colony?
Yeah, so like Tom and Meagan were saying, that, you know, really you want to allow, I know we're all super busy, but you want to allow that time to really assess the colony first before you take anybody else ashore. So take that time, assess the landing. If you see any signs, abort that landing. You're going to want to, of course, not touch any sick or dying or dead animals at all, unless you have a permit and are authorized to do so. But you don't want to do that. And you want to make sure that as soon as you're back, you're going to decontaminate yourself right away. Make sure that you're really, really careful with that. There's also a form for a high mortality event in the FOM. We'd ask you to make sure you collect the information that is in there so that we can process that, and to please immediately notify IAATO. You can do that through the ship scheduler all call email system if you would like, or just write directly, but I'd let IAATO know. Let the other ships in the area know, and then for your operator to let their national competent authority know. From there, the IAATO Secretariat, we have our own internal SOP. What we will do is we will close that site for assessment for at least 24 hours, could be longer, until someone can actually assess it properly, which means we'll shut it out of the ship scheduler, and that we will make sure that everybody who might have been scheduled there does know that that site is closed. So those are the really important steps. You need to get that information out there as soon as possible so that others don't become at risk, and that we can get professionals like Tom, who has his hand raised, to assess the situation.
Thanks, Lisa. Really good. Yeah, I think what I'd add is video. Video is really good. It's really good for helping people assess remotely. If you have scientists on board, but they're not permitted, don't ever be tempted to help. I think both Meagan and I are pretty scared of this, and unless we have the kind of hazmat suits and stuff with us, we're not going to go into a suspected colony. So, you know, it really, if it gets to Antarctica, it's not our fault as people, or probably not, but the risk of it spreading, thanks to us, is pretty high. So I think the vigilance to detect it early and report it is what is most useful.
That's great. So just to clarify on that as well, if we are approaching in a zodiac and we are suspicious already before we've set foot ashore, should we avoid setting foot ashore altogether and just get those videos and photos from the boat? I see lots of nodding heads.
Yes,
yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, I think that's good to clarify to people. It's more important that we don't set foot ashore and start moving pathogens around than get good video effectively.
Yeah.
And
but of course, like, sorry,
go ahead, Tom.
Your experienced naturalist, like, don't be afraid to debate it within yourselves. You know, if it is obviously, you know, show it to the more experienced naturalists, and they'll have a pretty good idea if something's a bit unusual or really alarming.
And one quick other thing to point out also is that obviously this is applying to shore right now, but we want to think about bird strikes, especially for those of you who are heading down to South Georgia early this season or around the Falklands. Please take the time to read and to listen to Tom and Meagan's previous webinar about how you want to react on ships and how you can handle the birds there with specific gear, protective gear.
And one more question for me for Tom and Meagan. Is it likely that if a colony has avian flu, it's going to be really obvious to us quickly? Or is it potential that we could have guests ashore and then start to have suspicions and then think, oh no, we've landed in an avian flu colony and now we've got to leave and undergo a massive biosecurity operation?
I'm not sure, but I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think you will probably see it before you approach. But places like maybe, so you know, some of the bigger colonies on South Georgia, maybe you'll find a pocket. So unknown, but I suspect we're going to see it early. The colonies we've filmed from drones in the north have been pretty obvious, to the extent that, yeah, if you sit and watch them with binoculars, you will definitely see a lot of dead birds, a lot of twitching birds.
You could potentially be at a site, a day or two before it might start to show symptoms. But generally, if there are birds showing symptoms and stuff like that, highly impacted, you will notice that. But I think as long as we are making sure we're cleaning and decontaminating, we should be pretty right. If you were there a few days before the symptoms showed up.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. So just to reiterate here, it's no sitting down anywhere near wildlife. If you do sit far from wildlife, biosecure like crazy your clothing. Really focus on your biosecurity this year and taking time to assess colonies before you go ashore. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on now to another discussion, which is social media and reputation management. So there were a lot of incidents last year reported to IAATO regarding breaking of guidelines, and many of these were caught by social media posts. So IAATO, again, has produced a good webinar on this, which is worth watching, but I'm going to reiterate some of the details here, saying if you're going to share an image before posting, ask yourself, does it accurately reflect our safe, environmentally responsible operations to the outside world? Does the photo need context to be viewed in the way I intend it? Could the camera angle or lens used make the image look like treaty guidelines are being breached? And could my image be copied and misused or misrepresented? So if you answer yes to any of those last three questions, don't post. We always used to say in the past, if you just provide context to that photo and say, the way I took this was like this, so no guidelines were being broken, that's no longer considered okay. The context needs to be all in the photo. Another rule, an operational procedure, is not to place things like GoPros down on the ground and leave it there. and then come back to get it later, which I know is something people have done a lot in the past. So again, I want to go back to Matt and also to Marieke as naturalists and ELs to ask how you visualize managing these changes. First of all, with staff, some of whom are highly motivated photographers who are maybe used to getting certain kinds of pictures, and also used to doing things like getting low, like lying down on the ground and telling the guests to lie down on the ground. And also, how might you manage this with guests?
Shall I go? Can everybody hear me? Because I just heard that it was a bit quiet. Is this better? Okay, good. Well, I think it's quite similar, and that maybe helps me repeat what I said before. I think a little bit, again, that we need to explain why we are making those changes. And I think for us traveling there and for guests traveling there to be able to continue traveling in this remarkable part of the world, we carry such a huge responsibility. And of course, we have more and more people visiting Antarctica. The amount of tourism is rising every year. So with that comes even more and more responsibility to make sure that we can keep operating and adapting the way we do. And so we as staff carry, of course, number one responsibility, because we are the example that we set for the guests who come. So to understand and to explain to the staff why these changes are in place, I think, again, is the key. And then from there on, we can tell the guests, I think, the same things. I think in briefings or in the first briefing to make guests aware how an image can be portrayed in a way that does not support responsible travel, how we want to show how we operate there. They also carry that responsibility in a big way. So to explain the steps that you're just describing, the question that we need to ask ourselves, I think should also be given to guests, so they become more aware of the questions to ask themselves when taking photographs and how they want it to be portrayed, because they are in the end also ambassadors of Antarctica, and we want to help them to become ambassadors of Antarctica. And I think this kind of responsibility comes with that. So the why, again, explaining, informing and reminding, I think are very important parts, again, quite similar to how we explain and try to manage the avian flu and the biosecurity.
That's great. Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, simply put, if you have something as beautiful as Antarctica, inevitably people are going to flock to it. And we're at a stage in tourism in Antarctica where it's growing in a way that we are at increased risk of having more than a minor transitory impact. So therefore, everything that we do needs to become a little bit more strict, a little bit more stringent in order to manage those possible impacts. And when it comes to photography and the equipment that's being used on landings, where you put your tripod or whether or not you use one at all now, that I'm not super sympathetic to, maybe because I'm not a photographer myself, but at the same time, Antarctica is not short of thousands of photographic opportunities. You know, I think a lot of people come home with more images than they could possibly process. So opening up that dialogue to allow the guests to feel like they're not missing opportunities, but in fact protecting Antarctica by not using their tripod, you know, is going to limit them maybe trying to do so when you're not watching, which is something we've all experienced before, but increasing that understanding. And then as for social media, the only thing I want to say about that very quickly is that there's a very important dialogue that needs to be opened up between guides, guests, but most importantly, our company's marketing teams, because they have access to photos from a huge number of different sources, whether or not it's the photos that guests are sharing them, but it's our marketing team that want those really dramatic photos and do not necessarily attend these meetings here where context is so incredibly important. And you know, that picture of the whale right next to the boat, or that zodiac that looks really close to the glacier face, that draws the eye, that draws interest, and that's going to be used by our marketing team. So that's what we need to have really clear communication within each individual company if we want to succeed in making sure that those images don't get out to the media.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you. One thing I sometimes have started thinking about is when I post an image is I think, would I feel comfortable being under pressure to reproduce this experience for every guest who comes after now? Because that's kind of what we're doing to ourselves, isn't it? And we're making rods for our own backs effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And I think to add a little bit, sorry,
no,
you go. It's just because I think there's a lot of guests that will be coming to Antarctica who have friends who have been there before. You know, people talk and share their experiences, and then they want to come, and they will have had the previous guests or will have had the opportunity to maybe get that spectacular photograph that some guests now also want to get. So I think, you know, we probably will potentially deal with a little bit of that guests maybe are disappointed that they can't lie down anymore or share certain images on social media. But I think to reiterate what Matt's saying, with the amount of people visiting Antarctica more and more, we have to become just more, slightly stricter in the way we operate, because there is just an increased amount of pressure. So to explain that, hopefully that guests will understand that, with that, things do change. And more responsibility. I think every year, next year, there will be probably maybe even more changes that we have to work with. So but there may be occasionally guests that say, but my friends or from previous times or people who have even visited Antarctica before, there's many guests who repeat. They go now to South Georgia and make a longer trip out of it, but they've had different ways of operating and now it's different. So again, explaining the whys, I think will be important.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's also an element now with the new avian flu guidelines, which also tie into the social media. I've seen a couple of questions coming in about using special butt pads to sit down on, and then we can separately biosecure them. And I feel like a big issue there is the photographs of people sitting down in a colony again. And then it becomes a thing where the permitting colony, authorities are looking at our posts and looking at the guest post and saying, they're still sitting down in the colonies, even after we all know we shouldn't be doing that. Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you very much, everyone. So I'm going to move on. Before we go into our grey areas, I'm going to do a few bulletins. So these are some more important seasonal updates, but these are not going to be discussions, but rather I'm just going to deliver or re-deliver some very important information that IAATO has already delivered to us via the webinars. So first of all, there's a move away from the term guidelines this year, and we should now refer to them as operational procedures. And this is try to alleviate grey areas and emphasize that these are not guidelines, but rather the laws we operate under. Because as soon as we put those guidelines in our permits, then according to our permitting authority, those are the laws. So we should try to refer to them now as operational procedures. There is a new voluntary slowdown in South Georgia, which is 10 knots, effectively on the continental shelf around South Georgia, and this is to protect cetaceans. This region is noted in the live ship scheduler and on Redport, much like the ones that already exist in Antarctica at the entrance to Crystal Sound and also in the Gerlache. So please keep an eye on that and bear in mind there is this new slowdown of 10 knots on the South Georgia continental shelf. There's also a new voluntary Vcaps marine mammal reporting system, which has been created by IAATO, and Gina produced an excellent webinar on this, which if you're interested in it is well worth seeing. Those who contribute to it will receive weekly heat maps showing where cetacean sightings were the previous week. So that can be very valuable information for us. So I recommend seeing that if you're interested in getting those heat maps and also contributing to our better understanding of where we're going to see, of where whales are being seen in Antarctica. Again this season, IAATO vessels will not interact with occupied National Antarctic Programme stations, even if the station personnel invite you, unless it's for authorised logistical assistance or special projects. So going back to the avian flu, a potentially acceptable place to sit down, but not bum slide, would be at the top at Paradise. However, while the station is occupied, we cannot land there. Finally, with ice, just a reminder to know your operational procedure distances, which is twice the height from an iceberg and at least 200 meters from non-active glacial faces and 400 meters from active glacial faces. So recommend carrying a rangefinder. And also on the subject of ice, there's to be no breaking of fast ice, especially in wildlife areas. We all know, those of us who work up in the Arctic are well aware of the huge value as habitat of fast ice. And we just need to get into that same habit of when we're south of, unless it's absolutely necessary, not breaking up fast ice. And I do encourage guys, especially new guys, to watch Will Abbott's webinar on driving in ice as well. There's some valuable information. So we're going to move on now to section 2 of tonight, which is our grey areas. So we're going to start with one that has been a little bit overtaken by events, which is it okay to have a close interaction with a penguin chick as long as the interaction is initiated and led by the chick? So we're making an assumption here. We're not in a COVID year. We're not in an avian flu year. There's no risk to the wildlife of doing this from a pathogenic point of view, but from other wildlife welfare point of view, is this okay? So could I maybe call on Tom to give us a comment first?
Yeah, so with the strict caveat of non-COVID, non-avian flu, I don't see a massive problem, but as always, I actually think it depends on the animal. And I think a really good rule of thumb is if you are approaching an animal, do it much slower than a lot of people do. So slow. And if the behavior is changing, then you are causing that, assume you are causing that change. And I think it's the same if it comes to you. You know, there are some animals that because of their size, we would want to move away from. But in a non-avian flu, non-COVID year, certainly penguins, I wouldn't have a problem. I think that's grand. They are curious. I suppose I'm going to point to Lisa. Any no, not as a bad thing. Lisa, any admissions?
So we within that caveat, obviously, and it's something that we have said in the past. However, the issue is the perception to the outside world, and that perception, whether meant or not, is a conundrum, especially for the national competent authorities who are giving you your authorization. So those national authorities, they do troll the internet. Don't be surprised at that. That's how they find a lot of the images on their own. And they're looking at interactions, and then they come to us and say, why are these people so close to the penguin? Now we know that penguin probably has walked up to you and is just curious. But it is always about the perception in that respect. It's hard to get our mind out right now of backing away because of avian flu, but in a normal time, with caution, with understanding the perception, and not with the enticing with the fingers out as you're sitting there and everything else. The animals do control that interaction.
That's great. Thanks, Lisa. So it's really good to see there's like the two prongs of this there. So from Tom, like from an animal welfare point of view, he doesn't see an issue, but from the effect on the industry point of view, there is an issue. I'd like to call on Matt here, who I think will have seen lots of interactions between people and penguins, where penguins, especially chicks, have approached people. And while Tom has said, in principle, this isn't an issue as long as the animal is in charge of the process and we're not approaching, and particularly not approaching too quickly. Matt, what's your feeling on how this actually plays out in the field when this happens?
How do I feel how it actually plays out in the field when it happens? Well, there's a million variables. It's a tricky question to answer because who's taking initiative first? You know, as an experienced wildlife guide, I know to not take initiative first and to watch the animal from a distance. And if that animal comes to me, hey, lucky day. This is, you know, what we're all hoping and dreaming for. Some animals like penguins are way more likely to approach you than, for example, killer whales, who are just beelining it and, you know, generally fairly focused and busy animals and don't have a lot of time for us. The difference is that we as guides have that understanding and we know what to look for. Guests, on the other hand, they just want that up close experience. And you're also more likely to get that up close experience if you're taking initiative. If you're inching and inching and inching into those penguins, you might incite curiosity. So, I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but the two things that really stand out to me over and over again is we as the staff, as the guides, need to be exceptionally vigilant in maintaining those procedures and those best practices. But as Marieke says over again, is that that's a lot easier for us to do, and it's a lot better for us to do if the guests understand why. Some guests are going to understand way more quickly. Some guests maybe not so much at all, and that's where the challenge arises.
Yeah, that's great. Would you have any further comments on that, Marieke?
I fully agree with what Matt is saying. We need to show the example. Well, when it comes to guests, they don't necessarily have the awareness. And I see it all the time in the field that we have to tell guests, could you please step away? Like even before COVID, the 5 meters for guests is suddenly like 2 or 3 meters. And, you know, to actually show them, no, this is actually 5 meters, which is actually 3 steps back. They don't really have that awareness. And I can totally understand that they're overwhelmed by the beauty of the place, all of this wildlife all around that are so curious. Then I think they, in those moments, nearly forget those guidelines or what we tell them, because they're just completely in the moment soaking it up. So it's us as guides that we have to really manage, and in a gentle and kind way, ask guests to maintain that distance, or in non-COVID or avian flu times, to still be very respectful of the animal, and, you know, try to be respectful as possible, and maybe let the penguin initiate it, but instead of us creeping up on it. But yeah, we need to take the example and help the guests, because if I think about my ever first time in Antarctica, never been there before, I was utterly overwhelmed and probably was like a guest to think, oh my God, and just go straight up and approach a penguin. So yeah, it's also understandable, I think. So we just have to be really vigilant, as you say, in that situation.
That's right. And Matt?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing that comes from personal experience outside of being an IAATO operator. And it's a message that I think is really important, that all guides and staff working in Antarctica understand together. And that is, do not underestimate the perception of what we do to the public eye, especially to those who can become our detractors. Antarctica is distant and remote, but with more and more people going there, it is gaining so much more public attention. And everything that we do with IAATO and the different authorities that give us our permits, authorizations, and regulations is on a foundation of trust in best practices. Now, the more we think to ourselves, like, I can get away with this just because I'm in Antarctica and nobody sees how close I am to this animal or to this iceberg, that has a ripple effect. And eventually, if we are not all following these guidelines or protocols as closely as possible, we're going to have less and less say and control in what we feel our best practices are, because the trust begins to break down, and the regulations and the best practices will be made to be more strict than we feel is necessary, because that's an easier line not to cross, pretty much. So we need to be really careful as the industry evolves, and we need to be on the same page moving forward.
That's great. That's really good. Thanks, Matt. So I think that's great discussion there. So we're going to move on to our next grey area. And so we're going to lose Tom and Meagan here. So guys, thanks very much for your input so far. And I'm going to introduce here Olive Andrews, a marine scientist who's going to assist us here. Welcome, Olive. And the grey area we're going to discuss here is what's less disturbing to a whale. Is it sitting in idle with your engine on during the encounter, or the engine start noise after the encounter? So is it better to keep your engine on or switch it off and then switch it on at the end of the encounter before you leave? So how do you decide that? And also, is turning your engine off a way of encouraging the whale to come to you? And is that okay? So I'd really like Olive's opinion on this first.
Thanks, Alex, and hi everyone. It's good morning from New Zealand. So guys, around the world we have regulations and guidelines for interacting with marine mammals, and the reason we have those is to reduce disturbance of the animals. So, and they're based on good science by good people. So it's important to remember that, IAATO has given us guidelines for how to interact with animals, and that is that we keep our engines on and in idle. And the reason for that is that whales are able to detect where we are all of the time. So for them, it's important that the animals determine the nature of the encounter and that we give them the choice whether they want to interact with us or not. So disturbance, when we think about what constitutes disturbance behavior in the animals and things to be looking for all of the time, is a change of behavior. So if the behavioral state of the animals, as we approach them from quite a distance, is that they are feeding, and then as we approach, they stop feeding, that's a change in behavior that can constitute disturbance. Changing direction, shorter or longer down times, or increasing the amount of time they spend on the surface breathing. Those are all perceived as disturbance behaviors. And the important thing to remember is that over time and cumulatively along the whole season, these animals are being disturbed to the point where we can be having biological or population level impacts. I think it's also important to remember that these animals are traveling, through to their breeding grounds, and they're being watched, by whale watching communities along the way. So for us, it's super important that we reduce the amount of disturbance that we have on these animals, and that is leaving your engine on so that the whales know where you are all of the time and they can determine the nature of the encounter. So that, if you leave it on and in idle, it allows them to choose. What was the second part of that question, Alex?
Yeah, well, I think the second part was really about is turning your engine off a way of encouraging the whale to come to you by effectively reducing potential disturbance.
No, not necessarily. So we've done loads of different kind of, in terms of science, we've marine mammal science folks, including myself, Rob Williams and others who may be on this call, we've done different sorts of experiments to look at, how whales respond to the approach of different kinds of vessels, to vessels that are under sail, to vessels that are under power, inboard engines, outboard engines, and different, angles of approach. And so all of those sorts of studies have gone into designing the regulations and the guidelines that we have, which is to never approach them from directly behind or in front. And, one of the kind of questions or, look, I'd say it's quite common practice actually, and I've seen it certainly down south, is that people go up ahead of the line of travel of the animals, quite a distance, and assume their kind of distance of travel is going to be, not disturbing them. Get up ahead of them and then turn your engine off and wait for the whale to come to you. And I would argue from, a science perspective that that's not best practice. Even if you're up ahead of the animals and you turn your engine off, if they decide to come and look at you, or they go into a resting type of behavioral state, and then, it's time to go and you have to turn your engine on, the impact or the startling that you can sort of have on the animal is it can startle them, it can change their behavior more dramatically than if you leave your engine on. So whales respond more negatively or more heightened disturbance behavior if they're within 100 meters and you turn your engine on than if you keep your motor running the whole time. So we know that from science.
That's great, thank you. That's quite a clear answer. But I would like to turn to Matt again here as a year-round, effectively, whale watching guide. I'm curious about your opinion on this, Matt, engine on versus engine off, and then also this element of, anticipating generally where a whale might be going and hanging out in that area quietly.
Yeah, if you want to sneak up on a whale, be as quiet as possible. I agree with Olive entirely that these animals are extremely acoustic, and that there is a delicate balance between creating so much noise that it is a disturbance to the wildlife. Hence why we have distance and speed regulations. 5 knots under 400 meters, but at the same time, if you have whales who are resting and you start approaching those animals, they're going to very likely become aware of you by the sound that your engine is making. If you were to row up to a resting or sleeping whale or kayak up to a sleeping whale, in that circumstance, you could probably get within arm's reach of the animal before it became aware of you, which is not what we want to do, but it points out their level of awareness. And for me, training new guides and working primarily with killer whales and humpback whales, one of the things that I try to reinforce the most with those new guides is that despite the mystery of these animals, and despite the time that they spend underwater, out of sight and perhaps out of mind to a lot of our guests, that we have to strive to understand their behavior. And that's a work in progress for guides who are going down to Antarctica for the first time. A whale dives and you don't think to time how long that animal's spending underwater. But if your whale is diving and surfacing 5 minutes later, then you can record its next dive and begin to establish a pattern in behavior. If you strive to look for patterns in whale behavior, you can become a better whale watching guide than unfortunately, a lot of seasoned guides in Antarctica have been, because they've never considered trying to understand those patterns. It's whales at the surface, I go to that spot. For me, often the whale's at the surface, but it's been doing 5-minute dives in a circle. If I remain at idle in this same location, which is in the general vicinity of that circle that the animal is moving in, not only do I have the opportunity not to follow or chase the animal with my propeller turning, I also give the animal an opportunity to choose to surface near me, because it can hear the engine and potentially see the vessel, and that choice is in its hands. I don't believe that turning off your engine entices the whales to come to you at all. I think it's the contrary. I think curious sounds, the sounds of the engines, or as some researchers or guides will do, tapping on the floor of the boat, whistling at the whales, things we don't encourage, but it's actually sounds that will entice those whales and bring them over to you. An idling engine may have the same effect, in my opinion, over no sound coming from the boat at all.
That's great, thank you. Some two really valuable responses there from Olive and Matt. Olive, do you have any response to any of the things Matt has said there?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with all of it. And I think that, an engine, when it's in idle, it also creates a vibration, right? So sound travels as a pressure wave in water, and that's how the animals perceive the sound. So they've got all sorts of other sound that they're dealing with, probably the main ship somewhere in a cove, within a kilometre away. or the engines of the ship or generators. Then they've got all of sort of the glacial type noises. It's a noisy place down there. If anyone's ever put a hydrophone, lots of crashing and bumping of ice and things like that. So the engine noise creates a vibration which could potentially, attract a whale, but certainly allows them to know where you are at all times and choose where they want to be in relation to you. So most certainly I would recommend the leaving of the engine on. And certainly some of the closest encounters or muggings by humpback whales that I've had in Antarctica have all been when I was at a distance of 100 meters with the engine in idle, and they came to the Zodiac and decided to approach us closely, and the engine was on and in idle the whole time. So it doesn't increase your chances of having a close encounter with an animal if you turn the engine off. The other reason I think it's important is obviously for safety, both for the guests and for the animals. That if a glacier comes nearby and you need to get out of there, you already have your engine on. It's important to kind of have that ability to be able to move if you need to.
That's great, thank you. We're shortly going to be moving on, but I'd like to finish with Marieke here. And I'm curious, Marieke, as an EL, how you choose to manage whale watching from zodiacs when you've got a large group of zodiacs. Oh, you're still muted.
I think with the vessels, of course, have increased in size, or the amount of guests that we have on board with 200 and over 200 guests. So yeah, you are sometimes with quite a number of zodiacs in the water. I think it's important to, of course, have a good plan and have a good meeting with the team about it, to remind them about the guidelines and the recommendations of how we want to whale watch, and remind them of making sure that we don't disturb or change their behavior. So I think that's really important when you go into an area where we are expecting maybe whales, or we've seen them and then we drop boats. I think there's always this choice, and I think it's good to hear from Olive as well. Is it becoming a guideline, or is it more a recommendation to turn your engines off, or leave them in idle? Of course, you sometimes have the questions to turn the engine off because it becomes this serene kind of feeling of hearing the blows of the whales and etc. And I've done that. I've turned my engine off in previous years and have had beautiful encounters. Sometimes they stayed away, sometimes they stayed closer. The science behind it really makes me more aware again that it's better to leave them on so they can hear you at all times. But I think it will be interesting to hear too, is it a recommendation? Is it something we all should follow? Or is it still something that could be situational? Is it something that we can decide when we approach the whales and we see that they are really relaxed around us, there's no change, to then be able to still to decide to turn the engine off, if that would be a possibility? I think that will be a good discussion to have, because I guess things can still be situational in the environment that we operate in. But yeah, I think it's important to communicate with the team, and especially also with the guests in your zodiacs, why we are doing certain things around the whales, why we may keep the distance slightly bigger, or why we are able to let them come closer and at their own initiative, to be able to communicate with guests how we operate, and to make sure that I think all zodiacs follow that, because we can't have one zodiac suddenly moving super closely and the guests say, but what about that person? I also want to be in that zodiac because they're much closer than I am, and they're starting to compare their kind of experience that they may be having, and that some guests may have a better experience than they are having. So we need to be on the same page with all of the expedition team, so everyone can have, not everyone has to be the exact same experience. We all experience different things, but when we are all watching the same group of whales, to make sure that all guests get an equal kind of experience around them. But yeah, I'm curious to hear, Olive, from your side as well, if we can still decide sometimes if it's a situational decision to turn off your engine maybe at some points.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I've looked to Matt as well here, or anybody really, to decide based on the conditions and the behavioral state of the animals. So, you know, if you're eating dinner and a truck drives past your house, you don't show a big disturbance response because you're fully involved in eating your dinner. If you're asleep in bed at 3 a.m. and a truck goes past your house, your disturbance response is heightened, right? So as Matt said, it's really important to determine the behavioral state of the animals and really watch them at a distance for some time and determine, are they traveling? Are they milling? Are they feeding? Are they resting? And based on that, you can make decisions about how you interact with them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah. I think that's clear.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I agree with Olive, and you know, I might be repeating myself, but if you have a marine mammals expert on board, which I think pretty much all our ships do, it's really good to allow them to lead whale watching, and perhaps even on board a little debrief at the start of the season or with new staff about just basics and maneuvering around whales. A lot of people have never driven a boat around a whale before working in Antarctica, so creating a shipboard standard goes a really long way to managing that experience, especially what you're concerned about with something I'm notorious for, guide, knowing how to get a better look at whales versus other guides, which puts a lot of pressure on other guides to perhaps move around whales more quickly or chase them around in order to try and get that look because they don't understand how. And I'll summarize here really quick because I know, Alex, you want to move on, but something that should also be reminded, and something that should never be underestimated, is that whales can pose a serious risk to your boat and to your guests, and even more so when they are not aware of you around them, and considering the fact that you are something that can change position without them knowing, and then that whale decides to breach, thinking that that area was clear of ice that it was going to land on, because you won't see them land on ice. They're making a mental note of what's above them before they jump out of the water. But then you put your boat in that spot in a small amount of time, that's out of that animal's control. And is same with super active feeding. If you're seeing lunge feeding, bubble net feeding, those are times where you really want your engine idling, and you do not want to be shutting down your engine, because that gives the whales that last minute notice as to your presence before such a huge animal makes a really dramatic movement and can potentially collide with you. The chances are low, but they're certainly not zero.
That's great. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a fascinating discussion. We're going to move on now, which means we lose everyone. So Matt, Marieke, Lisa, and Olive, thank you so much for joining us. Your expertise has been so appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to bring in a few new people here in our tough questions section. So we have Graham Charles, founder and president of the Polar Tourism Guides Association. Colby Brokvist, current chair of the board of the Polar Tourism Guides Association and active expedition leader. We have Danyau. He's a PTGA senior polar guide. He's also an assessor, and he's involved in training and development at the operator he works for. And we also have Hayley Shephard, an operations manager. So again, we have a big wealth of experience here and different viewpoints on the industry. So again, like with our grey areas, these tough questions were voted on by the guiding community. So these were the most popular things for us to discuss. And number one is regarding what is happening with all the new guides coming in to service the industry's expansion. We just heard a lot there, especially from Matt, on the value of experience. So when you're operating around whales, the key thing there was all about experience. So how do we manage that lack of experience when we need so many new guides and there are lots of new guides coming in? So Graham, how about we ask you first?
Okay. Welcome everybody. Thanks to the previous panelists. It's been really interesting and engaging. And and needed for everyone just to add more to the information that has come out from IAATO already. So thank you for that. How do we manage the new guides? I'm not sure. What I can say from my position and in dealing with lots of operations managers' questions, stresses as they try to find guides, there are a lot of new guides coming on board. PTGA certainly has had a greater increase of new members over a short period of time than we have in our history of existence on the planet so far. So that's a sign. So that's a good sign, because people are seeing some value in looking towards some industry standards, and a place like PTGA, which has kind of everything in one place, and finding that useful. So that's one way that people can get themselves sorted out. Obviously, there are the IAATO regulations on percentages of experienced staff that are allowed on an expedition team. Certainly from PTGA's perspective, we don't have that sort of knowledge, but we can only assume and hope that companies are working within those sorts of guidelines, and that there's a way to check that sort of compliance, because that seems to be have been an issue in the past. So and then the other thing is that I do know that a lot of companies are really trying hard to do a good job at induction and training of their staff, regardless of PTGA and what we have to offer, even if people aren't involved with that. I do know that people are genuinely trying hard to get good training and induction for their new staff.
That's great. Thanks, Graham. I'm particularly interested to hear from you, Hayley, as an operations manager and someone who's involved in hiring. And I know you work for a very established operator, and you probably have lots of established loyal guides, but you're very interested in your viewpoints, particularly if you tried to put yourself in the position of a new operator trying to get, guides onto your ship.
Yeah, well, thank you for this opportunity. It's certainly been a busy 8 months recruiting. I think I started recruiting back in March, and now we're just sort of getting close to the start of the season. And although we have established staff, I too have faced having to hire a number of new staff, new to the industry, new to Antarctica, and some, of course, just new to polar latitudes. So yeah, it's COVID obviously did a number on some of the guides. Where have they all gone? Because it's been quite an interesting situation. So what am I focusing on from this position? It's my job is definitely busier, because I've got a lot more communicating and regular emailing back and forth. Zoom has become my best friend, because it is a really good way to meet and interview and get a feel of a guide. So I feel like I've got shares in the Zoom company. But as far as preparing the new staff, it's making sure that the new staff are being scheduled with experienced staff on various voyages. So having that mix, it's important to have the right leaders that are leading potentially newer and experienced staff. So leaders that are really good at creating that supportive environment where staff can ask questions and not feel like they're stupid questions. So expedition leaders that really create that kind of emotionally safe environment for open forums of discussion. I know that I've had to be a bit creative as far as staffing particular roles. I've been a little bit more focused on hiring sort of more well-rounded guides that may not have experience in Antarctica, but they've certainly got experience in risk management, situational awareness, and again, having some key senior staff to mentor those new working in the environment. Yeah, I've sort of got a lot of random thoughts here, but if anyone wants to chime in with anything else, and I can carry on.
Yeah, Nico, I'd be very interested to hear from you as somebody involved in training and development, like right at the coalface, training the guides. What are the challenges you're seeing and the challenges that you're anticipating with so many new people coming in?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yep, great. So I work for Silversea, and during the last 2 years since we came back to service after the pandemic, we have added about 150 new expedition staff to the fleet. And as Hayley mentioned, there is a lot of our old guides, they have gone somewhere else. Some of them decided to take other full-time employments or whatever reasons, but it has been a challenge for whoever is doing the scheduling and staffing. And in my specific role, I am in charge of all training and development for the whole fleet with another colleague. And what we have been trying to do is to set a pre-season training for the Arctic and another pre-season training for the Antarctic. And we do the same with mid-season trainings. So we have been trying to do our best to bring all the new guides before the season starts or at the middle of the season and do a training with them. And on top of that, I agree with Hayley again, we are trying to combine new staff with old and senior guides. And the challenge that we see is that a lot of the requirements to join the ships are very, very difficult. STCWs and a bunch of paperwork that is related to our company. But what we are trying to do is to hire people with general knowledge that we can train in our pre-season training so that we can train on board. And on top of that, we are lucky we have 12 assessors moving around with Silversea that we are using not only to do assessments and make sure that everyone is competent, but we are training them towards those assessments. So we are 100% using the PTGA framework to make sure that every guide is competent and confident, and of course following IAATO rules.
That's great, thanks. So it's really interesting to hear there from people about how we can try to manage this situation, because there'll certainly be challenges in the years ahead. And I feel like one of these challenges, and this is something that I think has been seen a lot in Svalbard this last summer, is we have all these eyes on our industry, and we've heard this with the social media section earlier. How do we maintain a supportive environment for our community where it's okay to make mistakes and ask questions before we judge a situation? And so I'd like to call on Colby here. So Colby, how do we keep this supportive, cooperative environment going? Because, as an industry, while we are competitors, at the same time, once we're in the field, it's almost like we're one team working together. And how do we maintain that?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I appreciate this question. I think this is one of the more important things to consider, both for guide teams as well as the operations managers and expedition leaders aboard the ships. It's one thing to say, like, and recognize and acknowledge that we have these, challenges with bringing in a lot of new staff and building teams and adhering to our operational procedures. Yet it's hard to enact in the field. And so committing to things like giving dedicated mentorship, assigning dedicated mentorship to people that are coming aboard, holding regular debriefs, and where you have some sort of program laid out, like, all right, everybody, we just had, or maybe let's debrief today's activity or all of the activities at the end of the day. Maybe it makes more sense to be able to say what worked well, what worked well through lenses such as risk management, through decision making, to actual behaviors when we're on shore, the guest experience, what worked well, what is not working well, and have a structured, bit of feedback for everybody. And this is a place where people can embrace vulnerability, and the people that are managing these debriefs, facilitating these debriefs with everybody, can then be echoing and amplifying this idea of vulnerability is okay. We all have something to learn. Some people come with technical skills and they're great kayakers and zodiacers. Other people have subject knowledge skills. Some people are just great with guiding skills and group management, but we don't all excel at all of those things. And so to be able to recognize that within a group, allow people to feel like they're empowered to talk about weaknesses and build themselves up, is only going to make these teams stronger. And that'll translate to then participating in best practices and adhering to operational procedures and all those things that's important to us as an industry.
That's great. Thanks, Colby. And great to hear from someone who sounds like a fellow Brene Brown fan there as well.
Yeah, take off your armor, man.
Vulnerability there, yeah. Yeah, and so, but what about, so I'm curious with people, so, you know, that's maintaining a supportive environment on the ships, but what about the wider community? So I'm going to be vulnerable here and give an example of my own. This summer in Svalbard, we took the guests for a swim next to the ship in survival suits. So we were able to climb on ice floes right next to the ship. It was well managed. We shared some pictures on the Polar Guides group page, and we got some very judgmental comments that weren't based on knowing anything about the situation, but it felt like just immediate attack. So how do we, you know, maintain, you know, a supportive environment where people ask questions first and be curious with each other rather than trying to tear each other down? Does anyone have any comments on that? I see Graham has his hand up.
Yeah, that was a great example, Alex, and thanks for sharing that. In my time and in my development, my role at PTGA, I have definitely learned to make the first response that I have with these things is to ask a question. What is going on there, and to go to the source. And so, you know, I could only encourage everybody, you know, within our guide community or the polar guiding expedition cruise community, that you know, given the ambiguity of how we deal with these things these days in social media, with changing rules, whether, you know, someone may not have had a chance to take on board this information. Maybe they're working in a team where there's not that strength of mentorship and all the rest of it, and they do something and it's quite innocent. That whatever we do, I believe it's incumbent on us as family members, as group members in this thing, is to, first of all, whether you do it in person or online, is to ask the question. So particularly in your case, Alex, to me, the first response to that might have been, oh, that's sketchy, but it's like, well, let me ask. And so the questions my normal response now would be to say, oh, hey, Alex, you know, interested in that photo there, you know, why did you decide to do that? You know, is that allowed? What safety precautions did you put in place? Because I might like to have a crack at that, and you've already done it, and maybe you've thought about things that I didn't do. And as a fellow guide, you know, if suddenly we figure out that you didn't think about it, then we can have a discussion. But it just seems that instead of jumping on these things instantly, that as an entire community, that the first thing we should do is try to engage and ask those questions of each other, and then we can all get better.
Yeah, that's great. And I think this does tie back a little bit as well to the new social media guidelines, where trying not to post something where the context isn't in the photo as it relates to the permitting authorities. So Hayley, again, curious to hear from you a little bit here, because you're maybe somebody who's attending the IAATO AGM possibly, and hearing those conversations as well. I wonder if you have any comments here on how we maintain this supportive environment.
I think just what we're doing right now, we're having these discussions, these open forums, we're talking about difficult questions. We're all on exactly the same level of playing field. It's kind of like, you know, if you're an expedition leader on board and your team is late from wrapping up a landing, the last Zodiac, it's 20 minutes gone and the team's still not back on board with the passengers. Again, like Graham said, instead of jumping down your expedition team's throat, find out what was the delay. Yeah, so I agree, even from an operational perspective, that is a great approach within the team on board, and then of course the community as a whole. But just encouraging encouraging these kind of discussions and also the awareness that we have these operational procedures, but they can't be set in stone. There's got to be some kind of understanding that we have to deviate because of certain unusual circumstances. There's got to be some flexibility, and having that acceptance and knowledge and awareness within this community would help. Yeah, that's all I've got for now.
That's great. Thank you, Hayley. And I think that's a really nice note to end this tough questions section on. And we'll move on now to our Q&A, our open Q&A. So we're going to bring Lisa back here. And while we're waiting for some questions to be compiled by Lauren Farmer in the background, I'm just going to try to reiterate some of the main points we've covered here. So a reminder that this year, if a penguin approaches you, you have to back away. You can't let it come close. There's no sitting down anywhere around wildlife concentrations. And the purpose of that is for biosecurity reasons. So if you put something down on the ground, it's got to be super biosecure. Your shore bags down, they've got to be blasted with Virkon when you get back on board. If somebody does sit down away from wildlife, they've got to be super biosecured when they get back. If somebody has to sit down near wildlife, then you're going to have to manage that carefully, super biosecure them, and don't post pictures of it, because we've got to be very careful of the pictures that go out on social media and think about the context around them. If it looks like rules could have been broken to get that photo, we shouldn't be posting it regardless of the context in your caption. So we're always having to be very careful. Also, we need to be careful when we're wildlife watching with whales, and experience is key, and not trying to chase or approach whales, making sure they always know where we are, and also being aware of our cumulative impact as an industry. So it's one thing if it's just you, just your ship, but bearing in mind that a ship was in just before you and a ship will be in just after you as well. And I think what we finished with here as well is be kind to each other. So let's see what questions we have for the panel now. Let's see, what do we have? Okay, so a question here, how should we manage trips, including overnight camping, in regards to no lying down? So I think we're going to send this to Lisa.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, so camping it's not a forbidden activity. It's in your permits and authorizations. But what you do have to consider is where you're camping. So this year in particular, you're going to want to have to choose sites away from the wildlife. Now, to bring us back, yes, again, no sitting or lying down around wildlife or in wildlife areas. But when you're away from the wildlife areas and in situations like camping, you can sit or lie down, as it were. You'll just have to really, really make sure that all of that gear is completely decontaminated once you're leaving shore and back to the ship. So that may also increase the time that you need to break everything down, set it back up on the ship, to decontaminate, let it dry, etc. So just keep that in mind as you're picking those camping sites.
That's great. Thanks, Lisa. Just to really make this very clear, in the past, people might have sometimes used Nico as a camping site. So with these new guidelines, Nico this year would be totally inappropriate as a camping site unless you somehow managed to get a camper right at the top at the viewpoint. While also bearing in mind, we are strongly encouraged to always have crevasse rescue gear and trained personnel when going to that viewpoint. Would that be correct?
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, just looking for the next question. There's a question here about zodiacs and avian flu. So is there any possibility that our zodiacs would need additional biosecurity? Is that something we should worry about or not? I see Lisa nodding here.
I'll take that. I answered a little bit earlier as well. Your zodiacs, and I know, again, this situation that we're in now will create more work for everybody, for you as guides and also for your crew. But similar to what the South Georgia government actually asks you in your permit, you should be washing out and cleaning your zodiacs between each landing to try to minimize that spread. So staff captains, bosuns, all those who are working on those boats for us, it's really important that they will understand that and know that information. We'll make sure that we pass it on also out to the vessels via email as well very shortly.
That's great. And I think, would you agree it's valuable for ships as they come up with good ways to do this? Maybe they found a good way to clean out and work on their zodiacs, to share that with the fleet and share our best practices?
Absolutely. Sharing those best practices between you guys. I mean, we're in extraordinary times with all of these crazy things happening. So really upping that communication about everything between each other on the vessels, call each other on the radio, send emails to each other. You all have direct access to when you're out in the field and share those best practices. It's only going to make the entire industry stronger and also, frankly, make us look really good for the steps that we're taking as an industry.
That's great, thank you. Okay, so the next question here is, with expedition ships returning to the Ross Sea region and the New Zealand subantarctics, what is the communication between IAATO and the Department of Conservation? This might be one for Lisa again, sorry.
Sorry, I don't mean to hog the conversation. Yes, Ross Sea, we do have more operators returning to the Ross Sea. We've had some really great conversations within the Ross Sea working group about special considerations because the Ross Sea is very different to the peninsula. But we've also been communicating very closely with the stakeholders in the Ross Sea dependencies. So that's all of the bases there. That's with DOC, that's with PAS Parks, AAD, Antarctic New Zealand, the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust. So we're really trying to pull in all of those stakeholders so that everything is really, really clear when those ships start to move into the Ross Sea. So there's no miscommunications and everybody's reputation as well as the science is able to continue smoothly without being interrupted by any of our activities.
Excellent, thank you. I have a question here for Meagan, which is whether bird flu has already spread to the Southern Hemisphere.
So far as we know, we haven't had any cases of the Northern Hemisphere strain. Probably about a month ago, South Africa did detect bird flu again in African penguins, but that seemed to be the strain that they had last year. And there hasn't been any word on there being any mass mortality events happening there. So hopefully that has sort of not eventuated down there. Australia has just started their surveillance program. So far, so good. Some seabird stuff was done last week and they were all negative, and we'll start our northern sort of surveillance work in the next few weeks. And as far as we're aware, South America hasn't detected anything, but it's very hard. All diseases like bird flu cases should be reported to the World Organization of Animal Health, but it is up to each country to enact that reporting. So we are sort of, difficult to know where things might be popping up. But at the moment, Twitter seems to be one of the best places to find information. Everyone seems to be putting stuff up there, but so far the Southern Hemisphere, we're pretty good. North America, however, does have cases, and a recent paper has just come out that has highlighted North America and South America are the entry point for low pathogenic avian flu into the peninsula and the surrounding subantarctic islands. So we need to keep an eye on both North and South America.
That's great, thank you. Do you have another question for the panelists here? This is a question for Olive. So we talked about turning engines off in an effort to get closer to whales, but the question here is, assuming we're well outside 100 meters, we're a long way from that whale, is it better to just have the engine off there on the basis you're a long way away, just reducing the amount of noise generally in the water?
Tricky. So every situation, obviously, you got to determine the nature of the animal. Where is it going? Is it traveling? So if you're in the Gerlache and the whale is, you know, heading in one direction, and you've seen it surface 3 times and it's heading in the same direction each time, if you're 100 meters behind that animal, it's probably all right to leave your motor off. If you're up ahead of that animal and you know that it's traveling in your direction, I would recommend leaving your motor on. I mean, even 100 meters or 300 or 500 meters away, those animals are acoustic creatures and they can hear an engine noise, you know, for kilometers away. So it allows them to know what's going on in their area and again, make a choice. So I would still recommend leaving your engine on. I know that, you know, we perceive that it would be having less of an impact, but in actual fact, a lot of the whales that get hit by boats or have, you know, negative interactions with vessels are oftentimes with sailboats because they don't know that the boat is there and have surfaced, you know, right near it or got in the path of it. So even for sailboats, we recommend that you keep a depth sounder on so that there is just making some kind of consistent noise so that the animals know where you are. But yeah, depends on the direction of travel and where your boat is in relation to the animals. I'm happy to, Graham, I'll forward you some papers on whales and noise and best practice, which can then be available through the PG.
That's great. Thank you, Olive. I don't think we've any more questions for now, so I'm going to invite Graham to make some remarks before we close the summit.
Thanks, Alex. Super job as a moderator, my friend. Really well done. So if there's such thing as a, you know, full Zoom clapping for Alex. And of course, in the background, as I said earlier, Lauren Farmer had come up with this idea because my brain's too full to create these things these days. And thanks again, Lauren, for taking on this initiative and really making it what it is. Just want to reiterate, and also, you know, thanks to all our panelists, and in particular Lisa, who represents IAATO. And just to remind people, you know, why we're doing this, we plan to do these, as Alex said at the start, at the beginning of each season, polar and Arctic and Antarctic from now on. And it's not to be better or our own thing, but to augment the work that our fellow organizations like IAATO and IAATO do. And I really believe that the deeper, the more depth and more breadth we can spread these messages is better for all of us, because we know some people might not attend one particular thing and another group may have a different reach, but we're getting the same messages out there, which is fantastic. From a PTGA point of view, we'll make a PDF resource from these things. I've been collecting the questions that have been coming up, and we'll answer what we can in those questions, and we'll let you know when that resource is available. And also from day-to-day PTGA stuff, for those members that are out here, if you're not a member, then now's a great time to join pre-season. If you are, and you're still struggling, just so you know, and to clarify this once and for all, PTGA has a new member management system. It's in an application called TADAH, T-A-H-D-A-H. Now, a lot of people are getting confused, asking why the new website doesn't have all this information. What we need you to understand is TADAH is not the website. The PTGA website is still where it always has been. Logging on is the same, and all of the resources and papers and all sorts of stuff that are in there are all where they normally are in our website. TADAH itself is an application simply for the PTGA to run the member management, payment and finance through. Now, while there will be our online training will be based on there, the two applications, the website and the application, speak to each other all the time as to whether you're a member or not, and whether you get shifted from the application TADAH or back to the website. And if that was confusing already, then I can only apologize, but that's where we're at. And so if you are a member and you still haven't found some things, then you do need to log on and claim your new account, please. Out of our 542 members this morning, we've probably still only got about 50% of our membership have actually claimed their new login and details in our member management system, which makes it very hard for us to contact you and or to get information about things. So that was all I had to say, other than thanks again, Alex. I really hope people have a great season. Really would like to re-emphasize what Colby had said in his point that he made earlier, that have plenty of discussions. If you have doubt about something, or you feel unsupported or less knowledgeable than you feel you should be in order to represent the industry in its entirety and professional guideship in its entirety, then try to find somebody else, whether it's on email to a place like PTGA or someone else who you trust and respect, and ask those questions, because it's only through asking those questions and being open across the entire community, doesn't matter what company we work for or what industry trade association we are involved with, then you know, we need to have that information available and be able to find someone in there to answer those questions for you. So please, please, rather than jumping to conclusions or making mistakes, find someone somewhere and ask those questions. But otherwise, have a great season. Don't mess it up. Cancel social media somehow or other, and have a great time.
That's great. Thanks, Graham. So I just want to say thank you to all the panelists for joining tonight. The wealth of knowledge and experience has been so valuable. And I'd just like to echo Graham's words there, which is to talk to each other, share your knowledge, whether that's joining the Polar Guides group on Facebook and posing questions and sharing your learnings there. If you're an expedition leader, sharing it with the ship email list this upcoming season, and just always trying to do the right thing, to remain curious and to talk to each other. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to all the attendees for joining and asking the questions, and I hope everyone has a really great season. Thank you.